45 minutes. Good. This video is clickbait. I'm going to go ahead and tell you that now, right at the beginning of it. So is it really clickbait if I tell you that it's clickbait at the beginning? My name is Joseph Solomon. This is The Shores with Joseph Solomon. Happy Resurrection Sunday to those who celebrate that. Happy Easter. And for those of you who think it's a pagan holiday and want nothing to do with it, this video is still relevant and maybe possibly irrelevant. It's irrelevant to the topic itself. No, it is. Focus, Joe. Okay. So I think this is a great opportunity to address the focal point, I believe, for many Christians for the Bible, whether it be from an apologetic standpoint or just purely from a salvific standpoint, a standpoint of what saves us, what is our hope in this world. For the Christian, that answer would be the resurrection. The Apostle Paul says it himself, if Christ is not raised, then our faith is in vain. The entire enterprise is of no use to us. If everything else is true, but this resurrected Jesus did not really happen, then we of all people should be pitied, have sympathy for us for being so foolish, for following a dead Savior. So for the Christian, internally, the resurrection is extremely important to the validity, not just the historical validity, whether or not Jesus, the historical person of Jesus of Nazareth, really died and really rose from the grave. Did it actually happen? Can we trust the Gospel's accounts of that? But more importantly, once you move beyond the historical, you move into the future salvific. If Christ is not raised, then we won't be either. I think as a side point, relevant/irrelevant, I think that a lot of Christians, and myself included, for a good piece of my faith in Christianity, miss what the resurrection actually means for them as a physical reality. The promise in the Bible is not some ethereal reality of spiritual orbs floating around in heaven. Excuse me, my allergies are messing with me. But the promise is a new heaven and a new earth, whether that be a brand new earth or this refurbished one. That's not for me to discuss. But the idea being that there will be a physical reality, the promise, as the Bible says, that we shall be like him, like Christ, that we will be raised like Christ was raised. And Christ had a physical resurrection. He did not have a spiritual, metaphorical, or ethereal resurrection according to the Gospels. That he actually sat down and actually ate food after his resurrection. He had scars to prove that he had been crucified. Though there's also some different qualities about him. He can now walk through walls and he can float into the air, apparently, and ascend into heaven. As Michael Scott would say, he has the power of flight. So there is a somewhat new quality about his nature, but nonetheless, it's still very physical. And so the hope for the Christian is a physical hope, is a physical resurrection, which is why, churches used to have their cemeteries right by the church, and they would intentionally place the family members next to each other in hopes of a resurrection, so that when the dead are called from their graves, the first people they see are their family members. So there was this real hope in a physical resurrection and not some ethereal, metaphorical one. So the resurrection is extremely important for the Christian believer. Everything hangs on it. And even from an apologetic standpoint, you may hear arguments from those who want to make, apologetic / evangelistic. Let me say evangelistic, with maybe an apologetic twist to it. There's an evangelistic approach to it in that they say, well, if we can prove that Jesus really rose from the grave, if he really rose from the grave, then we can work back from there. So are you questioning whether or not the words of Jesus are really true, have any power? Are you questioning whether or not the Old Testament is something that is reliable as well? Well, we can start from the resurrection. If there's this man who makes all these claims, and then they come true, he rises from the grave, then we can say, well, there must be some validity to his claims, that if someone were to rise from the grave, then we would want to lend our ears to what he has to say. And so you can work back from there. And so the apologetic response from there could be, well, if Jesus really rose from the grave, then we can trust his words. Jesus was an Old Testament Jew. He believed in the Old Testament. He verified and justified the Old Testament, and he put his stamp of approval on it, so we can work back from there. So there's a lot of evangelistic, apologetic, and salvific importance on the resurrection within Christian theology. It is extremely important that there be a real resurrection, a real physical, that Jesus not be swooned, that he not simply faint and look like he died, or it's important that he didn't just have some metaphorical spiritual resurrection, but that he actually physically died, heartbeat done, done, clinically dead as Lazarus was dead for 3 days, possibly even stunk like Lazarus, and then rises from the grave. And as a Christian, when I was a Christian, I wrestled a lot with the resurrection apologetically, that was probably from one of my sort of rational arguments that I would try to use. How could they make this up? They had the women at the tomb. Women were not trusted sources of reliability or authority in the first century. So, if I won't go down the apologetic arguments for the resurrection, because that's not really my point today. There are a lot of rational arguments that people would make for the resurrection, and you may find them plausible. You may find them extremely implausible if you dive them deep enough, if you really ask more and more questions. I think at best, though, and this may be getting to the heart of what I really want to speak about concerning the resurrection as a launching pad for the entire enterprise of Christian faith, at best, if you really spend time with the debates and the literature, whether from an N.T. Wright, who is pro-resurrection, or a Bart Ehrman, who is anti-resurrection, or at least extremely skeptical of the resurrection, it's not an open and shut case as people would like to present it. That to make it seem as if it is quite easy to present the resurrection as the only possible explanation for the explosion of Christianity in the first century, the more I wrestled with it became more and more disingenuous. Not saying that if you walked away believing that the resurrection was true, then somehow you are immediately disingenuous. For me, the disingenuity or the disingenuousness of it comes from the posture in which you walk away from it. That this was somehow an easy task. And it's not. That this is somehow a black and white situation. And it's not. There's much debate about it that I don't know if we'll ever quite get to. But this is indicative of a larger issue that I see with rational apologetics for Christianity, the whole faith and rationality, faith and reason walking hand in hand as they are somehow happily join, and there's really no issue at all. This is not just with the resurrection. This is with concerning the age of the earth. This is concerning the origins of the earth, the origins of man, the historicity of the New Testament, the reliability of the Old Testament, whether or not it was changed by different Jewish generations over the years. These are all hotly debated. There's not somehow some huge consensus between secular scholarship and Christian scholarship, and at the core of it, oftentimes when it is a hotly debated thing, Christians will often give the reason being, well, they're just out to disprove God. There's this obsession with being anti-God, and they so don't want there to be a God or specifically the God of the Bible, that they will do anything. Evolutionary biologists will do anything to prove that God has no command over us. And I think that's just I don't know what fallacy you would call it. I don't know if that's an ad hominem or whatever. It gets you around the issue and doesn't actually help you deal with the issue that is at hand, the chasm that is between faith and reason. I see it as the land masses of like Eurasia and North America. At one point, they were connected, and you can kind of see that when you look on the map, that you could imagine that there was a connection, which is how we believe that people were on North America by time Christopher Columbus, quote unquote, discovered America. How were there already humans there if we started off on the African continent and, we made our way over to Asia and then we came over here. And so the Columbus thing is actually the rediscovery of North America is actually a quite interesting point in human history, in that Homo sapiens were reunited with each other for the first time. There was these completely different branches of humanity happening over on one continent. And for the first time ever in human history, we were rejoined with one another. And that was met with much colonization and disease and syphilis. That's how that event happened. But I see the land masses now. If you want to go from Eurasia, Europe to America, Asia to America, Russia to America specifically, you can't just walk over there. There's no land mass to walk across. It's a huge body of water. You've got to take a plane. You've got to hop on a plane and you've got to fly over. And that's how I see the chasm between faith and rationality, that oftentimes Christians would like for you to believe, they would like for themselves to believe. And though at certain points they would diverge from this, that they would say, oh, no, I know, I just believe it. And not putting enough emphasis on that wide chasm between the two land masses of faith and reason, that it's not something that you can just walk across. It's not something that you just can even swim across. This takes a much greater form of transportation. And from reason to faith, it would take faith and faith only. And the reason why I bring up the resurrection in this case, and the reason why I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of the arguments for or against the resurrection. Let's say that the resurrection actually happened. Let's say that Jesus really died, Jesus of Nazareth, who led a revolution against the ruling, the popular Jewish thought of the day. He had his own cult. He was a cult leader, and his opposition to Rome was not a spiritual one. Him being the king of the Jews in a spiritual sense was no threat to the Roman government, but rather it seemed like a political threat. And anyone who has any ambitions of leading a political revolution, political rebellion against the Roman authorities are getting put down. So this was very much a political thing. But in any case, whatever the reason was that Pilate decided to crucify Jesus, let's say that has no bearing on whether or not he rose from the grave. Did he actually rise from the grave? Now, I don't think that we're equipped historically or rationally, even just the way that doing proper history works, you have to assume for the most reasonable explanations for events. Resurrections aren't the most reasonable thing. They are, that is what would make the resurrection special in and of itself, is that it doesn't happen all the time. We're not going to get into whether or not other people have claimed to rise from the grave in ancient history. Let's stay focused, right? It has no bearing on that. It is the fact that the resurrection is so unreasonable is what makes it a bit anti-historical, but more importantly, that is what makes it so special. That if people were rising from the grave all the time, if we could have historical, reasonable, rational explanations for why people were raising from the grave all the time, and we could see this even in recent history, then, well, one, we could verify that Jesus rose from the grave. Great. Like, oh yeah, that's a reasonable explanation. Jesus rose from the grave. But simultaneously, it would make the resurrection not very special. It's not very special. That's like, that would be almost akin to saying, oh, Jesus once had the flu. And if we could somehow historically, rationally prove that one time or even a few times in Jesus' life he had the flu, I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, there's no historical accounts of it, but if there even were just one or two, maybe even four ones, right? We'd be like, oh yeah, that happens all the time. People get colds and people get flus. Like, sure, yeah, I can believe that. But the resurrection is not a common event in human history, which is what makes it so special of a claim. So let's assume that this claim, this special claim of the resurrection is, in fact, an historical event. It really happened. The issue that I come with, the chasm that we have between faith and reason, is that the fact of the resurrection would be what the philosopher David Hume would call an is-ought problem. This is the same problem that Christians present to naturalists, people who don't believe in God, and try to come up with, say, moral standards based on what is in the world. You know, we can use science to describe what is in the world, but it will never get us to what we ought to do. This is not a moral problem, right? So for instance, we can use statistics to show, I live in LA, there's homelessness around us in abundance. And we can use statistics to show how much homelessness is present in Los Angeles. And we could also even have statistics to show, you know, how many of those people have mental illnesses or where they come from, what is the ethnic makeup of people who are unsheltered. And we can come up with all sorts of scientific explanations for the problem of homelessness in LA, but it doesn't tell us what we ought to do about it. We could never science could never tell us ever what we ought to do about what science showed to us. What we ought to do about homelessness is a philosophical issue, is a moral issue, possibly even a theological issue, but it is not a scientific problem. Science can tell us nothing about what we ought to do with it. And so relegating the resurrection simply to a type of science, historical fact, let's say it actually happened, it still doesn't get us to what we ought to do about it. Why ought I believe? And any appeal that you make would inevitably lead to some sort of subjectivity. Is it the best for me to follow Jesus, who claims to be God, he rose from the grave? Why ought I do that? It really kind of, maybe that leads us to like what is it called? The divine command theory, is that it's good because God commanded it. Like we were commanded to believe. And so therefore we ought to believe. And then that runs into the issue of like, well, why is it good to do good? and this is a real, I know this sounds kind of petty, but this is a serious thing to think through. That the is never gets us to the ought. Let's say that God does exist. The God of the Bible exists and he commands us to do X, Y, Z. Why ought I do what God commands? Well, because he's the God of the universe. He has the ultimate authority. And so you should listen to him. But why should I listen to him? Because what he wants for your life is good. Why should I want good for my life? Well, because everyone should follow what is good for their life. Like you would want what would help you flourish the most in life, right? Not just in the physical life, but even in the spiritual life. You don't want to see eternal damnation. Why ought I want? And again, let me just say flat out, obviously, if there was ever an eternal damnation waiting for me, I don't want it. Personally, I don't want to experience that if that was a real reality. However, me not wanting that is a purely subjective issue. You cannot appeal to what is to get you to what you ought to do. Why is it good to follow good? Even if you decide that, because there is the issue of like, well, God wants us to do good, and goodness doesn't exist outside of God. There's not something that he has to appeal to. Goodness is within God, according to Christian theology. And even still, why ought I do the good? So, and follow me here, because the point I'm trying to make is that you cannot, and there's many other ways you can stress this point, but I want to make use of the time. You cannot get from rationality to faith on rationality alone. It doesn't get you there. And I think Christians know that. I think that's at the core of their, at least for the Protestant theology, that you're saved by faith alone. But to present it as if faith somehow, the act of faith, not the faith propositions, the theological propositions of Christianity, but faith itself. So you can maybe possibly get rationally you can get there from rationality to the claims of Christianity, the truth claims about the nature of God and the resurrection even, and the validity of the Bible and all these things. You can, rationality, I don't think you can, but let's say in theory, it is theoretically possible to get from rationality to the claims of Christian faith, but it does not get you to the act of faith itself. It can never get you there. And so that's why I believe that the whole enterprise of even trying to do apologetics, I know that some will say, well, we do the work for God, and then there's probably some other theology behind it, that God uses these people to work, and I don't know, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of it. But my point is that there is a huge chasm. And to make it seem as if you are somehow relying on rationality to uphold your faith, relying on rationality to somehow keep moving in faith, is disingenuous and also irrational. And I think that, man, you're going to hear me talk about him more on this channel because I've been obsessed lately with Soren Kierkegaard. And I must say, I feel ashamed, actually. Let me just show my shame for how much time I sacrificed reading theological giants, your Spurgeons and your modern Sproul or whoever, apologist James White, or your Van Til's and your, I don't know, whoever I was reading, Keller, whoever these giants were, Wesley, I read a lot of Wesley and a little bit of Whitfield, and go on and on and on. I was so hyper-focused on theology and not philosophy. Even I was taking philosophy in seminary. It was just kind of crazy. Is that I'm listening, I'm learning about philosophy, but I'm learning it through the lens of theology. I'm reading them through the lens of whoever's teaching them, and they're giving their own perspective on them. And I'm not interacting with them directly myself. I'm learning about Nietzsche, but I'm not actually directly interacting with Nietzsche. There's a safe barrier between in me, like if it's almost as if Nietzsche is in the interrogation room, and there's maybe other theologians that are there interrogating Nietzsche, but I'm safe on the other side of the one-sided mirror, and I can just kind of look in and yeah, see, but I'm not in there myself, which would be a lot more dangerous to be in. And I have now. I've decided, I've been on my Nietzsche trip and reading God is Dead, Good and Evil, Genealogy of Morals and stuff like that. And so I'm ashamed that I haven't really been able to, or I didn't allow myself to really dive into other philosophies directly, even from people like a Kierkegaard who was Christian, who was very devout Christian. He is the father of existentialism, though. You can consider him to some degree irrational. I think he's rational, but also understands the limitations of rationality. And from Kierkegaard, we get your Sartre, and I always hear his name pronounced differently. Sartre, I've heard Sartre, I don't know. Another existentialist, Camus, and even Nietzsche. Like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard, are sort of two sides to the same coin of existentialism. Nietzsche being the self-proclaimed Antichrist, and Kierkegaard really being, in many ways, the self-proclaimed Job, the devout servant of God, despite all the absurdity around him. And I appreciate Kierkegaard for that. As I'm reading, I may not have jumped to the conclusion that he's at, but I do appreciate him highlighting the jump that has to be made. You've ever heard the term the leap of faith? It actually comes from Soren Kierkegaard, though he doesn't actually say leap of faith. It's more of a leap to faith. And his whole point, I've been reading Either Or, and I just finished Fear and Trembling. And I'm typing out a whole video about this. I actually want to start typing my words more, but I just want to get this off my chest. But he, in his book, Fear and Trembling, he's analyzing the story of Abraham and Isaac, and how Abraham was called by God to sacrifice his only son that he had waited decades and decades for. And now he's going up to sacrifice him. And to make this short, I want to make sure how much time I got left. To make this short, I got a little bit of time. Essentially, what Kierkegaard is saying here is that there's different spheres that we can operate in. One he calls the aesthetic, which is the lowest level of human interaction or human existence. Essentially, the lowest struggle, which would be aesthetic, which is that which is pleasurable, the things that we can consume within ourselves, good music, food, sex, drugs, fun, even philosophy itself, So aesthetic is, even though it's the lowest form, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's unrefined or dumb even. You can be the highest of philosophers and sit in your room and pontificate about the nature of existence and life and humanity and all that. And you're still at the aesthetic level. And then in the next realm is the ethical level, what he calls the universal level, the ethical level, the level of morals, the interactions that we have with other people, the obligations that we have to other people. To exist only in the aesthetic level leads to you sense in a real sense, the absurdity and the futility of life, the abasement of life. And so in the ethical, it can be understood between individuals what is to be done or not done in the moral realm. And this doesn't necessarily even have to be objective. I don't think it's objective. I don't know if he's got plenty of books I'm going to read. I don't know if Kierkegaard would understand the moral as an objective thing. Morality in and of itself could very well be subjective, even for the Christian existentialist. He's still an existentialist. And existentialism essentially is that every individual is on his own playing field at the end of the day, and he has to make these decisions for himself. he is presented with many choices, and that in and of itself is the angst of life, the angst of making choices, and that you are in the wild, infinite abyss of real decisions to make for your life. And as a side note, not only do I appreciate Kierkegaard for his honesty about the chasm between faith and rationality, but also his honesty about the absurdity and morbid nature of life, how despairing it is. If you're a Christian, as a side note, and you are one who is always filled with angst and depression and worry, and you have the sense that maybe this is just your sin or that it is some problem within you, but you also have the sense that there is some wisdom to your anxiety, that your anxiety may not necessarily be the disease itself, but rather the body's alarm to the disease that is in life, which is the absurdity and meaninglessness of choices and decisions, and the paralyzation of the infinite choices that you can make in this world. If that is you, you might want to check out some Kierkegaard to at least feel heard. I don't know if he's going to be a voice of comfort. He may be a voice of comfort in that he is sharing a similar experience to you, and that can always be comforting. But back to my point, the ethical realm is something that is above the aesthetic, and yet there is a limitation to the ethical realm. And that Kierkegaard says is there's something higher than that. There's the level of faith. And that's where Abraham is operating when he is called to murder his son Isaac. Soren says that, man, on the ethical realm, what he is doing could not be understood in any moral goodness. What he is doing is absolutely wrong. And so to kind of tie this into, for instance, the rational moral argument for the existence of God, the argument being that, well, if there was no morals, if there was no objective moral giver, then we would have no objective basis for morality in this world. And that would just lead to utter chaos and utter confusion and all these atrocities in this world. I'll make another I have so many objections to that, but I think even Kierkegaard, the devout Christian, has some objections to that argument as well. I believe, if I'm understanding him correctly, I'm extrapolating from him correctly, that I think he would have objections to that as well. Namely, in the prototype of faith, Abraham being the father of faith, an exemplar of faith, the Christian religion, Jewish religion, as well as the Muslims, all called the Abrahamic religion. Abraham is that dude. And yet, the height of his faith is not in simply believing that God would bring him a child through his wife, Sarah. He went through that. But here comes another peak. Another challenge in his faith is that he now must give up what he waited for so long, and not just let him go, but to murder him and to therefore violate all ethical codes. There is no ethical reasoning. There's no way that you can communicate that what Abraham is doing is good in any sense. What Abraham is doing can only be understood, at least from the rationalist perspective, if they're looking up. The rationalists, maybe if we're in the ethical realm and we're looking up at Abraham in the religious realm, what he is doing cannot be understood in any practical terms. And this is very different than people who say, oh, yeah, see, you might see that and see it as something that is inspiring even. See, yeah, I make movements for God that are not based on rationality. I moved, or I went to this mission trip, or I did X, Y, Z. You did something that may have sacrificed your own good, and say, yeah, I move in faith. But Kierkegaard would say, you don't understand what I'm saying. This is not inspiring. This is, in every ethical sense, evil. You are now in violation. Many times Christians, religious people will use this divide between, I'm not making rational decisions. I'm using my mind. I'm using my heart. I'm following God in faith. But what you're doing would not necessarily be considered morally abhorrent. Like, even if you're a pro-lifer and those who disagree with you may call what you're saying is evil, even your position, if you're being, you have anti-gay marriage stances and you're saying, I'm moving in faith, I'm believing what God says, and I'm not, but even your stance on being against the moral codes of the society around you could be understood in some sense in the ethical plane, but not with Abraham. For there was nobody who on the ethical plane could consider Abraham a good man. He is violating his duty as a father to protect and love his son. And even if this was a human sacrifice, is say in other ancient religions where you would sacrifice children for the sake of the good, the good of the few, the good of the many is better than the good of the few. Even that could be understood in that moral structure, right? That I would sacrifice my son so that hundreds or even thousands of other sons may live. That would even be seen as noble. It could be communicated on the ethical realm. But there is no social structure to this. This is purely a private affair between Abraham and God. And Kierkegaard is saying that is what faith is. And he says, if you understand me as trying to encourage someone to go out and do some heinous crime for God or whatever, that's not what I'm saying at all. That if you find, and that's why the book is called Fear and Trembling to begin with, is that if you find any peace about that within your own self, if you find any peace about Abraham and his actions stuck in between Isaac and God, then you misunderstand the entire enterprise of faith to begin with. To feel the tension or the chasm between faith and the rational world is to be the knight of faith. So how do we get there from the resurrection? My point being, I really think I just want to use the resurrection as an excuse to talk about Kierkegaard. I told you it was clickbait. And so I don't feel bad for it because I told you in the very first few seconds of the video. But there is some relation to it in the sense that as I'm on this journey of figuring things out and I'm consuming and trying to make sense of this life, there's something truthful that, this video is not to encourage people to leave Christianity or for those who are not Christians to jump into Christianity or even make my claim that I'm somehow trying to do one or the other. But I am trying to show some window into the thoughts that I'm currently having and the things that I'm currently wrestling with. And I would hope that Christians would be honest, the religious would be honest with themselves. I want both groups to be honest. So here, the religious, I want them to be honest with themselves and understanding that you don't get to walk across the chasm of faith and rationality so easily. To pretend that it is that way is disingenuous. To pretend that there is some rational, and you're striving for rational arguments. Go and make those rational arguments, but you have to realize that even if rationality gets you as close to the infinite as possible, the rational finite world gets you as close to the infinite as possible, nothing finite can get you into the infinite. You have to make the infinite leap to faith. And so in a mathematical sense, even if you got as close to the infinite through rationality, is essentially the same as being as far away from it as possible and still making it to the infinite. That if you didn't know much, you didn't have much rational argument for your faith at all, it is still the same as if the most rational person would jump to faith, because infinity minus 100 is still infinity. And infinity minus 1 million is still infinity. The infinite leap. You are making a leap of infinite. In any comfort you try to give yourself from the rational world is disingenuous and needs to be reevaluated altogether if you understand the enterprise of faith. And then on the flip side, for those who who remain in the finite world as I do, who use rationality to make sense of their world, you also, I think Kierkegaard has something to say to us as well. And what I've experienced for myself is the absolute absurdity of life, that making the leap to the infinite, as we see it, is an absurd thing. It makes no rational sense. But even life on this side also is absurd and irrational. That ultimately, and I would believe, and I've experienced this as a Christian, and I've experienced on this side as well, that life is full of despair and angst. And there will be moments of joy and happiness. I think the promise of religion oftentimes is that somehow God, real faith in God, relieves that. I don't think that's true. I don't think that that's the story of real individuals in the Bible. If their life somehow somehow leads to a story of joy, even in the midst of problems. Like, you can have joy in your suffering, and that may be prescriptive, but it's not descriptive of real experiences in the Bible. It seems to be full of angst, vanity. All is vanity, as the preacher says in Ecclesiastes. And yet we are also very acquainted with the realizations of the writer of Ecclesiastes, that life is vanity. It is full of vanity. And there is an infinite leap to make for us as well, to make sense of this world, to live in a way that we are all accepting some sort of delusion. By living itself, by doing anything today, you are making a movement of delusion. And what do you do with that? It at least gives me some sort of empathy and understanding for those who have made the leap or continue to make the leap to faith, because in many ways we're both doing. I'm not saying that the leap to a specific religion somehow solves the issue. So Christians who are still listening, this is not a pass. Hopefully I'm communicating this in a way that is understandable. But as I would say, this is not me saying that you must end it all or give it up either. There must be something genuinely done about this, as the philosopher Camus kind of presents. He's the one who brought up that famous question. The only real philosophical question is whether or not one should commit suicide. And you may hear that and think that the conversation stops there. But really he says, well, if life is truly meaningless and absurd, then he's also an existentialist, by the way. If life is meaningless and absurd, then your death would also have no meaning as well. And you don't really solve the problem of meaninglessness. You only circumvent it. You only get around it. You only just kind of try to step around it, but you don't go through it. You don't deal with the problem head on. And what I'm also not suggesting is the next thing that he proposes is philosophical suicide. He says, well, you can also pretend that everything's okay, and then pretend you can pick up some worldview that you know is not true, i.e. Christianity or whatever, world faith, astrology, whatever, just supernatural in general. You can pick that up, and you know it's not true. You don't believe it, But then that's another type of suicide. It's a philosophical suicide, and it doesn't deal with the question head on if you've come to the realization of the absurdity of life. And of course, his last sort of suggestion is that we all just sort of muddle on. I think he would explain it a little better than that. But there are real issues to deal with, and there's a real chasm between the finite and the infinite. And purely, simply observing what is in the world, or even what happened in the world, say a resurrection, doesn't get us there. There's still bigger fish to fry, bigger oceans to cross over. And that is the essence of human existence, is trying to figure out day by day, what ocean are we trying to cross over, and how do we do it if we can't simply walk over it? So, happy resurrection.